Buddy, welcome back to another digital lesson, this time a short one on Massachusetts Bay Colony that'll go along with a online textbook assignment. And at the end, some documents to check out that'll also give you the gist of what we're looking at with Massachusetts. And I think that most of us are familiar with Massachusetts, northeastern United States, just south of us. In fact, we are sitting or standing on what used to be Massachusetts until 1820. So what we're going to eventually do is contrast this to Virginia. Either you have already seen Virginia or you're going to in your next class. We're going to take a look at the differences between these two colonies because even though they're both British, even though both are going to be part of America, they are very, very different. And that's going to be kind of a theme we're going to explore is how are we going to make a country when all of our colonies are really different to the point where they're almost like their own little countries as far as the way people act there and what they're all about. So Massachusetts is actually the second colony established by the British. So in some of my classes, you've already seen Virginia. That was the first. Now there's going in reverse order. We're starting with Virginia second, or going with Virginia second, starting with Massachusetts first. And we'll take a look at that colony in class. Either you have or you will. And you see where it is up there in yellow on the map, up in that upper northeastern right-hand corner. Massachusetts, the biggest thing about this is it starts as a religious colony and created by Puritans. And a Puritan is somebody who wanted to purify, hence the word Puritan, the English or Anglican Church. See, by this time we're talking about here, right around the late 1500s, early 1600s, England had gone and split away from the Catholic Church, and they were known as Protestants. However, the king at the time, King James, was acting in a way and behaving in a way that made people suspect that maybe he had some Catholic sentiments, and that maybe he himself was a secret Catholic. And that didn't sit too well with Puritans who believed that all Catholic traditions should be purified from the church and the church be a strictly Protestant, non-Catholic church. One of these groups was the Pilgrims, and they decided the best way to get away from this Catholic influence on England was to leave England entirely. That's why they were called separatists. They were going to separate themselves from England and start their own colony. And they're the ones who end up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, right around 1620 or so. So that after Virginia, they show up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they end up on a piece of territory that was once an Indian village and make that place, Plymouth, their home. Now, Puritans, unlike Pilgrims, wanted to stay English. They just found it was so difficult to make changes to the church. Again, King James, the head of the church, wasn't willing to make those changes because he was too Catholic. He believed in some of the Catholic faiths and Catholic sacraments, beliefs. So the Puritans decided what they would do was they would leave England. But again, they didn't want to be anything but British. They went to Holland because the Dutch were Protestant as well, and they figured they'd fit right in there. But the problem was the kids started picking up Dutch traditions. And the big one was they started speaking Dutch and not English. So these folks, these Puritans, that was the last straw for them in Holland. Nothing against being Dutch and nothing against the people of Holland, but the English people were like, we're not Dutch. And we don't want our kids being Dutch. We're English and proud of it. We need to find a place where we can go and keep our religious traditions, but also allow ourselves to maintain the English identity that we have. So again, the Pilgrims were first. They were the first religious dissenters, meaning they came to Massachusetts, and they were separatists like we were mentioning, wanted to separate from the English church forever. And they end up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And that had been an old Wampanoag village. That was the native tribe that had been around. And people knew where they were because British tradesmen had made contact with these natives a long time before all this. But smallpox, like it had lots of other places, had done a number on these natives. And when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth, there were no natives there at the time. It was an abandoned place where natives had been. So the land had already been cleared for them. There were clearings, trees had been cut down. They used that territory so they didn't have to clear the land themselves and settled on that and called it Plymouth. Now, the Pilgrims probably don't survive for very long if it hadn't been for some natives who did return. Squanto was one of them, and Massasoit was a Wampanoag chief. Both of them spoke English. Squanto had, in fact, been kidnapped by the British and put onto the ship and be forced to work on a British ship. So that's how he knew how to speak English, because a really good question people ask sometimes right here as well. How are they communicating? Because they don't speak the same language. Well, Squanto did. And Massasoit, I forget if Massasoit did or not, but Massasoit had dealings with the English in the past, and neither one trusted the British all that much. But they helped them survive, which ended up being somewhat maybe of a bad move for their own people down the road. Because once Plymouth was established, and the Thanksgiving legend, of course, takes place there, once it was established, people realized they could survive in the New World. That led to more Puritans coming over, led by this guy, John Winthrop. And John Winthrop wanted to establish what he called a city on the hill. And that's his quote, you see. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes the Lord our God, as we, his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all of our ways. We must consider that we shall be a city on the hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us. Now, John Winthrop's city of a hill turns out to be, Winthrop, Mass., but right across a small piece of water, what's now Boston, Massachusetts. That is the city on the hill. And John Winthrop founds Winthrop, now Boston, right around 1630. Now, what he meant by a city on the hill was he was going to have a city that would be a model of how all Christians would live their lives, working together, making each other's conditions our own. What that meant, putting community first, not like it was in Virginia where the individual pursuit of wealth was the number one thing. These people, they were meant to live as they felt God intended, as a community, with each helping each other out. So this is how they lived. Take a look at this New England village. If you're looking at that, the blue streak, and this is primitive art, I know, did the best I could with Keynote here, but that blue streak is a water source, such as a river. And each of the yellow squares is a dwelling that in the town, down by the river, people would live and work. Each of those yellow pieces would be a house, but also an establishment. Your candle maker would live in one house, and maybe a butcher would live in one house. And maybe somebody who would make iron, a blacksmith, would live in one house. Every one of these houses provided a service. And that service was something that the village needed, but also would make them a living. Of course, the church surrounded all of this. The church was right in the middle of town. And that was the one that kind of dominated the landscape. And as you got further away from the water and away from the church, you started getting into farmland. And some of these villagers would be farmers. And they would, of course, be providing the food for this village. So every person in this village in Massachusetts, in New England, had a purpose. And that purpose made them a living, but also benefited the community as a whole. And it was the church that tied them all together. And I wonder if you hear this description and see that primitive map, if this sounds at all familiar to you. As we look right now, there's Hollowell. Isn't Hollowell built this way? The shops down by the river, a church right in the middle you see right there, although in Hollowell today there are several different churches. Would have been one back in the day if this was Massachusetts. And then as you get away from Hollowell, heading up the hill and out of town, you get into more farmland. Gardner's set up this way. Richmond set up this way. Most Maine and Massachusetts towns, in fact New England towns, are set up this way for a reason. So that people would live close enough to each other so that their service would benefit everybody, and they're all tied together by the church. So that's the way New Englanders lived. So what's that mean as far as their culture is concerned? Well, first of all, religion, that means at the center of everything. It was the center of government. The religion, the church, was also the government. And rules they made came out of biblical scripture, right out of the Bible, the Ten Commandments. And you had religious freedom, but not the way you would think of it in a Massachusetts village like this. Religious freedom means that they were free to worship the way they wanted to worship, but you were not free to worship your way. Things were very rigid in these Puritan New England towns. You had to worship the way the village worshipped, or you were not welcome there. It was a society where everyone had a purpose. Everything was done to make a community stronger, which meant the sense of community is really important. People took care of their neighbors. Community was more so even than the individual themselves. They believed that poverty and oppression was sinful, And they would try to find a way to make sure that didn't happen. That didn't mean everyone had the same amount of money and they were all equals. It wasn't like that. These are not socialists. However, what it did mean was that there wasn't a massive gap between wealthy and poor, and that hard work was valued. Even today, that's a stereotype of New England, that New Englanders are extremely hard workers. Well, if that is indeed the case, perhaps we can trace that back to our Yankee roots and this format of living where hard work was valued. Everybody had a job, and if you didn't work, that would leave a void in your community. Of course, we couldn't have that, so people did work to make sure that they were filling that void and taking care of themselves and other people. As I mentioned, oppression was a sin, so trying to make sure that nobody was oppressed. Yes, some were poorer than others. You're going to have some rich and some poor, but no one was so poor that they were suffering or they were oppressed. People had what they needed. And that was the way New England towns were set up. However, while this all does sound good in some ways, it causes problems. For one, not a lot of room for originality. In freedom, in really many ways. Roger Williams was a guy who wanted more freedom. He wanted true religious freedom. He thought the church was getting too powerful governmentally. And he believed that people should have the right to be members of the government without being members of the church. And he believed that people should worship in a way they wanted to worship. And if the church became too powerful, it would end up oppressing people and taking away their rights. He started saying these things in Massachusetts, and church leaders didn't like hearing them at all. So what eventually happened to him was he was banished, exiled from Massachusetts, and he went to what's now Providence, Rhode Island. Providence meaning from God. And Providence, Rhode Island is a colony that was founded on true religious freedom. You could worship pretty much any way you wanted to. As far as you were a Christian anyway, you could worship any way you wanted to. Now, there'll be other colonies that allow for a complete religious freedom. This wasn't total religious freedom. You still had to be Christian, I believe, in Rhode Island. But at least this way, you could worship your Christian faith the way you wanted to, and it was less rigid and allowed for more individuality. But that's what happens. You don't toe the line in Massachusetts, you end up getting banished. Roger Williams, still a famous name in Providence. As you guys get older and start looking at colleges, I bet you'll start getting emails from Roger Williams. It's not him, but a small liberal arts college that bears his name is down in the town he founded in Providence, Rhode Island, a school that sometimes we have people from Halldale go to, although I don't have a Roger Williams pennant in my room as of now. Another dissenter that caused trouble, Anne Hutchinson. She said that the church was starting to get too political, kind of what Roger Williams said, that they're abandoning God and people are pursuing political power. And she also disagreed with the predestination aspect of religion. See, these folks believed that life was predestined, that God had a path for you, and you were to walk that path. And God had already chosen out and mapped out your life. Well, Anne Hutchinson said, well, if God's already mapped out my life for me, then what does it matter if I behave in a certain way that might be against the church? Because that's how God planned it, isn't it? Well, they didn't agree with that at all. The idea of free will and individuality was not something these Puritans would agree with. And it's bad enough to speak against the church. When you're a woman speaking against the church, this is a very male-dominated society, as most European societies were going back to the 1500s, or actually not back that far, but certainly back to the 15 and 1600s. So she was also kicked out. She went to Rhode Island, although some folks who believed like she believed started spreading out into western Massachusetts, like Springfield, and north to Rye, New Hampshire. And you start to see not just Massachusetts, but all of New England starting to be populated by these folks who had different beliefs as far as how hardcore they were in Christianity, but all believed in the importance of God and belief in helping your neighbors and being part of a community that was designed for people to help each other. That's what the Dominion of New England became. By 1680, the British controlled all of this. That's what it was called, the Dominion of New England. Even parts of what's now New Jersey and New York were part of that. Now, England did it back in England not because of religion, because the territory was growing so much, it had to be organized. And England wanted to organize it to make sure the more organized it was, the more efficient, more easily, and more cheaply resources would come out of the Dominion of New England and go back to England itself. That's the way everyone's going to make money here down the road. Resources from New England, especially timber, will be sent back to England. England will manufacture things out of that timber, and use it, but also sell them back to us, so everyone's making money that way. Now, that's the start of the church influence in New England fading a little bit, but it never will go away. Religion will always be a hallmark of New England when it comes to this colonial time period before the American Revolution. And it's not going to go away. Those religious roots and those community roots are there, and they'll stay there. So what's going to happen next? Well, as more people move in, there'll be more problems and conflicts with natives. Some issues that already existed going back to the 1630s in Connecticut, the Pequot War, for example. The more people tried to spread out on a native land and decided they couldn't coexist with the natives, but wanted to try to change the natives' belief system and convert them to European ways, the more there was trouble. Native tribes were able to live peacefully with Europeans. It's just when Europeans and natives all looked at land, they looked at it very, very differently as far as the concept of land ownership, as we talked about earlier. And it set up some big-time problems. Even up here where we are in Maine, major wars fought throughout northern New England in the 1680s into the 1700s. One was Queen Anne's War. And it includes a very famous event called the Norridge Walk Massacre, because the French were involved in this as well. Up here in Maine, we're right in the border of French territory and English territory. As you may remember from the video earlier, French settlers had a tie-in with the natives and were allied with the natives. So there were clashes here between English and the French with their native allies. And that was going on here. And a major event called the Norridge Walk Massacre takes place in Madison. That's the culmination of this Queen Anne's War, where one of the Jesuit priests, a French guy by the name of Father Sebastian Rall, ends up being killed in a raid and dies a martyr. People make him out to be for dying for the Christian or Catholic cause, because religion's a big part of the why these wars are going on as well. We won't get into tons of detail. I include that just to let you know that all this is going on here where we are standing, right here in central Maine as well. So I want to check out some documents, and they're attached to this assignment in our Google Classroom. What I want you to do in those documents is what's there in yellow. What are you noticing in the document that relates to what you now know about Massachusetts? Can you make any inferences, meaning things you can now say are probably true about Massachusetts based on the document? Also, does anything in the document stand out like it might be important? You don't even have to know why it is important, just that it might be. And here are 3 documents you have. Document 1 is a passenger list from 1635 of a ship going to Massachusetts. It's a primary source document in that it's the actual document that was created, just copied for us in a neat, legible format we can all read. The second from 1636, some articles of agreement in Springfield, Massachusetts. What are you noticing in that? And what's that telling us about Massachusetts? And document 3 is entitled Wage and Price Restrictions in Connecticut. That, as you'll see, the date on it is from 1676. So 40 years after we're talking about here, time has passed. So what's gone on in 40 years that you can get out of reading that document? Now, I warn you, this might be difficult, and you may not be right in what you're getting out here. You probably haven't worked with documents all that much. It's a vital part of studying history, though. You can't just take what a textbook says. You got to look at documents as well. So do what's up there in yellow for those 3 documents and take your best guess. And what we will do is we'll start the next class talking about Massachusetts and what Massachusetts was like, and we'll then relate that and compare that to Virginia, which we will do in class. So I told you today it was a short document overall, a short video overall. What you'll now do is go on and check out those documents and put that in writing so you have it for you. Don't forget it between now and our next class. Put it in writing so we can start talking about it next time, those 3 things in yellow for each of those documents. I will check on at the end of class if you have questions for me, but that's what you're working on today. So I told you, shorter video, we've come to the end of it. Check out the documents and see what you can discern, what you can find out they're saying to you. I will check in with you later on. Good luck working on those.